much, Maya, for setting this up, and thank you everyone out there for joining us. We have what we think is a very interesting discussion today, the uses of artificial intelligence in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Jeff Atik, and I teach at Loyola Law School together with Karl Manheim. Karl and I have been teaching artificial intelligence here for several years, and have had already a sizable cadre of students that have studied AI with us, and we're delighted to see that some of them are here listening. I'm going to principally be doing the hosting here, which is to say I'm going to pose the questions, and everything of meaningful content and of high quality you'll hear will come from the lips of Karl Manheim.
Unless I get into trouble, in which case I turn it back over to you.
Well, we may do a little bit of that if needed, but I'm quite confident that you will enjoy the presentation. So we've got some slides that'll be running in front of you, and we'll take you through a presentation that looks at, again, some very intriguing possible applications for artificial intelligence with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. As far as mechanics go, we're going to run through our presentation, which, based on our past timing, takes about 25 to 30 minutes, leaving us a period of time, 15 minutes or so, that we can take your questions. If you're new to Zoom, or you're even a Zoom veteran, we're only going to use the chat function for Q&A. So if a question occurs to you as we're running through our presentation, just type it into the chat, and when we go back in the allotted time for the questions, we'll pull those questions from chat. And I think Maya's got it set up that way. So with all of the mechanics out of the way, let's get down to the substance. And it is my great pleasure to present my dear friend and fellow teacher, Karl Manheim. So Karl, before we get into the topic of the day, which of course is the application of AI in the fight against the coronavirus, I wonder if you could start by giving us a general overview of what it is when we say artificial intelligence. What are the technologies that we're describing, and perhaps contrast artificial intelligence with the various digital technologies that we're familiar in our everyday usage.
Sure, my pleasure to start with a general overview of AI. I won't get too deep into it so that we can spend most of the time talking about the virus. But artificial intelligence describes various computational tools that tend to emulate human intelligence. AI takes sensory and data inputs, runs them through a series of algorithms, and outputs results. What sets AI apart from other computer processing is its access to vast amounts of data and the architecture of its algorithms. Machine learning, a form of AI, learns as it goes. Another form is deep learning. That uses multiple layers of artificial neural networks to identify patterns in very large data sets and reach conclusions about that data that are often as good as or better than those reached by humans. There's been significant investment underway in medical artificial intelligence, including medical machine learning for biomedical research and clinical practice. The FDA has already approved approximately 40 AI-based medical devices, mostly for diagnostics such as X-rays and MRI imaging, and predictions based on clinical data. IBM has an AI engine you may be familiar with called Watson. It's now being used to advise oncologists. Google has transitioned its DeepMind AI, known for beating chess masters and Go masters and Jeopardy champions. It's now being transitioned to Google Health for similar uses. AI health apps and chatbots are now widely deployed on websites, an Apple Watch, such as I'm wearing, and other wearable sensors. AI is also being applied in biomarker and drug discovery. We'll get into that in a little greater detail in a bit. But recently, the FDA has approved the first digital pill consisting of a drug combined with an ingestible electronic sensor to aid in patient adherence to the medication regime. Other Millie robots are being used to target specific tissues or to deliver precise doses. So as you can see, the medical community is one of the early and most robust adopters of artificial intelligence.
Great. So let's now turn to the topic of the day, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Give us an overview of how artificial intelligence might be deployed in response to the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, so we're talking about coronaviruses, and they have been around for a long time, maybe 1 billion years or more. They account for approximately 1/3 of all common colds. It's in the same family of Coronaviridae. But 2 variants of coronavirus are particularly deadly to humans, MERS and SARS. The novel variant causing COVID-19 is called SARS-CoV-2. AI is being used by researchers, clinicians, and public health officials in every facet of the battle against COVID-19. So here are some examples. Predicting the spread of the virus and epidemic curves, containment strategies, patient testing and diagnostics, drug, vaccine, and antibody development, very, very important. Clinical trials of drugs and vaccines. This is the long ramp up for the availability of therapeutics, and patient care.
So, Karl, what then does additional capabilities does AI add to our traditional set of tools? Where do we get a speed up? Where do we get improvement due to the deployment of AI in these areas?
So Stanford University's Human-Centered AI Institute just recently had a conference on this very topic. And so a lot of groups are getting involved. The Decentralized AI Alliance is sponsoring in a few days COVID-a-thon, an AI hackathon to develop new tools for COVID-19. And a lot of prominent AI companies are making their resources available for free to COVID-19 researchers and clinicians. But here are some specific examples of what is being developed currently. First, we would have AI thermal cameras are helping to identify COVID-19 symptomatic people. That gets combined with facial recognition software that can be deployed in airports to monitor the disease, enforce restrictions. That's already happening. The Chinese company Alibaba, we know the Chinese version of Amazon, has developed an AI algorithm that is being used widely to identify COVID-19 in CT scans of suspected infections. It's being used to help identify biomarkers in blood samples for patient triage. Mount Sinai Hospital in New York is using AI to determine when COVID-19 patients can be discharged, safely sent home. And Berkeley's new COVID-19 testing facility up north uses industrial robots to process test samples far faster than human lab technicians can. And in addition to that, we're accelerating basic research through the use of natural language processing to query what has become a worldwide open research database for COVID-19. So one thing that is different with this disease than we've seen previously is the amount of collaboration going on around the world among researchers, both in private and private companies and educational institutions, research institutions. Ordinarily, people like to keep their data quite private, in order to monetize it through patenting, but there's been a lot of public disclosure with this particular pandemic. Robots can also help. So a hospital in Wuhan was recently staffed with care robots to relieve exhausted healthcare workers. Care robots are a major advance in robotics and being widely deployed. A Danish firm has deployed hundreds of decontamination robots to hospitals and is planning to send them to prisons, hotels, and airports. There's a Texas company doing something similar. And so the list goes on. Just almost every area of intersection between COVID-19 and public health is being impacted by artificial intelligence at the moment.
So we're now in a phase where the states and municipalities are releasing us from our stay-at-home restrictions. And this new phase is described as one that involves both testing and tracing. So I was hoping you might give us an idea of what is contact tracing and what does it involve?
Right. Forecasting the spread and penetration of disease has long been an important and essential tool for public health. Traditionally, trained personnel interview people who have been diagnosed with a particular disease, and then try to track down all the third parties that they've been in contact with during the relevant incubation period. Then those parties are contacted, and so on. You ultimately build an infection tree so you can see the trajectory of a disease. There's a bill pending in Congress right now, which has the, Congress always likes to give its legislation cute names, and this one has one. It's called the Testing, Reaching, and Contacting Everyone Act, or TRACE. It even has a great bill number, HR 6666. And this would fund all these traditional types of contact tracing activities.
So what are the new possibilities? What does AI potentially bring to the deployment of tracing technologies?
So we're beginning to see contact tracing using artificial intelligence. The one that has been in the press the most lately, and we may all be familiar with it, is a joint effort by Google and Apple to create application program interfaces, or APIs, that will allow software developers to create contact tracing apps that for both iOS and Android phones that will sit on top of the APIs. Those apps will enable communication among nearby smartphones over Bluetooth wireless, such that phones in close proximity to one another will register and exchange identification and other information. And then that information is stored in cloud-based data sets generated by those apps. And those data sets will enable AI through data analytics to identify hotspots and contact networks. When an app user notifies the cloud server that she has been exposed or has tested for COVID-19, the server will then automatically send out notifications to all the other contacts that have registered for that particular users, and perhaps persons several degrees removed. The contacts can then take precautions such as getting tested or quarantining, but that information could also be used to set permissions for access to businesses, commercial establishments, classrooms, social events. Contact tracing, this is a really important tool if we're going to reopen our economy. A vital part of disease surveillance. AI does it better and has already outperformed the WHO and the CDC in tracking coronavirus. For instance, in December, a Canadian AI company called Blue Dot identified clusters of unusual pneumonia cases in Wuhan and notified the WHO, which was its first indication. Canada, South Korea, and Singapore have already deployed contact tracing mobile apps, and deploying them early allowed them to slow the spread of the disease. There are, as far as I know, at least 50 other initiatives currently underway internationally by private companies, government agencies, universities, to develop and deploy contact tracing apps.
So our phones are going to be if effectively pinging off each other. Sounds like there's some privacy concerns with all of that. Give us an overview of what's the privacy implications of this kind of ubiquitous contact tracing technology.
Yeah, well, especially to the extent that the apps are exchanging personal health information or providing that data to public health officials, it will raise profound privacy concerns. And this is especially true for apps that collect and share more than just COVID-19 data. As their name implies, they are also tracing or tracking apps. So other personal information such as geolocation, business and social networks, and even your activities can either be collected or reconstructed from the raw data and then shared with others. And even in a regime that requires informed consent and a requirement that users affirmatively opt into the service, the privacy issues are significant because most people don't know what the downstream trajectory of their data is.
So let's talk about privacy law. How does privacy law operate to protect us? Is the law of privacy robust? Is it going to have to bend to accommodate the public health exigencies in this area? What do you see?
Yes, the answer is yes to all those questions. You know, for the generally, we expect HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is our main federal privacy statute enforced by Health and Human Services, to regulate the data collection, storage, the security, et cetera. So far, I'm not sure any of these contact tracing apps or devices have been seen as triggering HIPAA. The HHS Office of Civil Rights did issue a guidance a number of years ago about wearables such as the Apple Watch that can collect health data and forward it on to medical professionals. But that we're still really early on in thinking about HIPAA as covering these kinds of activities. So I think it's fair to say that we don't really have robust privacy protections either on the national or the local level at this point. And so that raises a huge concern. A consortium of privacy groups has created a data set that is not a data set, a set of proposals that they're calling decentralized privacy preserving proximity tracing, or DP3T. That stores personal information locally on each user's phone rather than on the central server. The similar approach is being proposed in the European Union, the Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Project, or PEPPT. Privacy and lawyers love to use initials.
Yeah.
Another approach is to generate an ephemeral identifier for each contact. And those identifiers will rotate every few minutes and disappear after, let's say, 15 minutes, and that will promote anonymity. Now, Apple and Google switched course recently and have apparently endorsed the decentralized DP3T protocol. They've stated that apps running on those phones will not collect location information. However, public health officials respond that those limitations will render the apps virtually useless in containing the disease. So that's the trade-off that seems to be emerging. I'm not convinced that it's either privacy or public health. I think you can have both. Start off by anonymizing and encrypting the contact information at all stages of the data cycle, perhaps even putting it on the blockchain. But there's no quick fix to this. Privacy and security remain big concerns, especially as contact tracing apps get deployed on watches and smart speakers like Alexa, which can be programmed, for instance, to listen for dry coughs, sneezes, and your searches. So this is a wealth of data, which would be very valuable to public health officials, but also could be used for pernicious purposes. the public health officials would like to combine that personal, clinical, location, and social data, including family history, lifestyle habits, data obtained from your social media, because that will enable them to make more accurate and precise predictions of individual risk profiles, healthcare results, and the proliferation of the disease. Of course, once these apps are developed and deployed, no matter how salutary this purpose is, they can be used to trace matters far beyond COVID-19.
Great. So let's turn now to the search for both a cure and prevention. How can AI help us to identify what might be an effective vaccine or effective therapeutics for the disease? It's a daunting prospect. What does AI have to offer?
Yeah, it's a daunting prospect. The drug discovery process is extremely laborious and expensive. Arthur C. Clarke once said, "Science demands patience," and nowhere is that more apparent than in biomedical research. On average, it takes about 15 years to bring a new drug to market. For every successful drug, 1,000 or more fail, either because of toxicity or lack of efficacy. As a result, the average cost for a new successful drug in the United States is over $2.6 billion. And it's a similar story for vaccines. The FDA has approved only 7 new vaccines in the last 25 years. An Ebola vaccine was approved, but that was 3 years after the Ebola epidemic seemed to disappear on its own. So that seems to be the recurring trajectory. We defeat these pathogens through other means before we get a vaccine or a therapeutic. So drug discovery typically involves identifying molecular compounds that interact with a pathogen, a virus or a bacteria, and disrupt its replication cycle. These are tested against the virus in vitro, i.e. in the laboratory. There's a fair amount of guesswork involved in this process, since each molecular structure has its own properties, such as whether it will bind to a virus or to the cell. As a result, tens of thousands of compounds might need to be tested for each viral variant. And even after the FDA approves a drug or a vaccine, they have to be manufactured, perhaps on the order of hundreds of millions or billions of doses. And that requires GMP, good manufacturing practices. So while a lot of research is being done in academic labs and small biotechs, they typically don't meet GMP and must therefore collaborate with large pharmaceutical companies that do. So there's kind of a queue building up right now. There's a lot of folks who have promising drugs and vaccines, but they're not going to get any approval from FDA until they can first establish that those drugs can be made safely and effectively.
So it appears that vaccines, like therapeutics, there can be a vast number of candidates. I think I heard that there were over 1,000 candidate vaccines that are being examined at this point. How can AI help us in winnowing down those numbers to locate which of those candidate biomolecules have the best prospects for further study and eventual development?
Yes, exactly. Well, AI can speed up the process. It excels at finding patterns and relationships in large data sets, and the data may include protein structures, genomic sequences, patient clinical records, diagnostic testing, and known drug interactions. For instance, machine learning algorithms can explore in silico, in other words, in computer chips, large chemical spaces that are prohibitively expensive for traditional research. A promising AI tool is called geometric deep learning. This is being advanced by IBM's DeepMind in a product they call AlphaFold. It models the shapes of viral proteins, such as the spike protein on the coronavirus, to aid vaccine development. So think of this as facial recognition for viruses. Another new tool is generative adversarial networks, or GANs. GAN-based models sample thousands of chemical structures without the need for explicit design. And then those samples compete with one another to achieve the desired properties set by the researcher. And that leads to a much smaller set of candidate drugs to advance for further development. Those two tools by themselves are taking years off the drug development program. AI is currently being used by over 200 biotech companies in some aspect of drug discovery. UK scientists have developed a microscopic molecular machine that rapidly assembles individual molecules, a task that usually takes biochemists weeks or months to do. The British company Excienta, these are just some examples. Excienta became the first to present an AI-designed molecule that has actually gone to human trials. So we are making progress.
So in a similar vein, when we have, again, these large number of candidate therapies or vaccines, can AI help tell us which ones are going to be safe for human use?
Yeah. So just because a drug works in the laboratory doesn't mean that it's going to work in humans. In the lab, a candidate drug, is usually administered directly onto the virus. You know, it's poured all over the virus in the petri dish or in the test tube. But in a human, the drug needs to get into the bloodstream, find its way to the infected organ or tissue, and do so before it's degraded by the body's own elimination system. And then it has to work as expected. As a result, typically only small molecules are effective. They need to have good pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, and bioavailability characteristics. And so that's what's tested during animal and clinical trials in vivo after a drug has proven effective in the laboratory. AI is useful here in optimizing molecules and predicting drug characteristics and responses once inside the human body, so we can eliminate lots of drugs that we think that would fail the human clinical trials. So those techniques are now being applied to COVID-19. Google is using its DeepMind system to identify the proteins that make up the coronavirus, which then present druggable targets. A Stanford University team is using AI to examine fragments of the virus to determine how it might be used or applied to vaccines. And that's similar to what that Cambridge company, Moderna, has done. Its vaccine in development consists of partial strands of the virus's RNA. Coronaviruses are RNA-based, not DNA. Once injected, the RNA strands trigger the production of the proteins, which then signal the body's immune system to produce the antibodies. And we hope those antibodies will stick around in case of a real infection. Many other efforts are underway. I did a quick search yesterday on medRxiv, which is an online repository for bio and pharma researchers, and that yielded 233 search results just for AI and COVID-19. So there are apparently that many different groups trying to apply AI to this virus. But I should say that many of biomedicine's existing paradigms for therapeutics are outdated. Most of the low-hanging fruit has already been plucked, yet we continue to look for our lost keys under the light post, even though they're not there, because at least the light is there. And that describes much of conventional drug discovery, which is why we haven't had many pioneering discoveries or blockbuster drugs lately. So I'm hopeful that AI will help us discard some of these outdated models and better understand the biology of the cell.
So assuming that we find a good candidate, both from the point of view of effectiveness and safety, we then enter what everyone says is a very long and difficult regulatory process before the drug therapy can be released. Talk to us about what the therapy process looks like, generally speaking, and specifically with respect to COVID.
Yeah. So this little graphic illustrates the several phase process that the FDA requires before a vaccine or a drug can be manufactured, marketed, or prescribed in the United States. To gain approval, the drug first has to go through these three phases of randomized controlled clinical trials. Phase one typically consists of a very small number of healthy volunteers that test for toxicity. If it passes that test, it is then administered in phase two to two somewhat larger populations infected with the virus. One group is given the drug while the other gets a placebo, and then the double-blind results are compared to see if the drug is effective in combating the disease. Phase three, which is the last phase prior to approval, consists of a much larger test group, typically in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, where toxicity, dosing, bioavailability, and other metrics are further evaluated. If the FDA is satisfied with the results, then you get an approval. So that's the therapeutic drugs. Vaccine testing is similar, but in some ways more heavily monitored. And that's because you're injecting typically a degraded version of the virus into a healthy person, creating a risk that you would be giving that person a disease that it would not otherwise get. So that means that these clinical trials are subject to very close monitoring. So Moderna's coronavirus vaccine has, at this point, survived phase one and is heading into phase two, although its sample size is extraordinarily low. Only 8 volunteers in phase one appear in the data set that Moderna has made public. So I, for one, I'm not getting all my hopes up for that particular vaccine, but Jeff, as you say, there are hundreds of different companies involved in this process at this time. And one of them will, or more, hopefully more than one, will succeed.
Well, but even somebody as sober as Dr. Fauci isn't prepared to wait 5 to 7 years for the deployment of a COVID-19 vaccine. So what can AI do to speed up this very lengthy process so that it can be distributed?
Right. Well, this graphic helps us understand the difference between traditional a regulatory approval process and AI-aided approval. It should come as no surprise that clinical trials are expensive, often ranging in the hundreds of millions of dollars and taking up to 6 years to complete. AI and big data analytics can speed up that process. They can assist clinicians in selecting and recruiting patients, helps them design better trials, helps them with patient engagement, helps them monitor the patient compliance, and then ultimately managing the data and interpreting the results that emerge. So it's not just COVID-19. As we move into personalized and precision medicine, AI is going to become indispensable in designing and running these clinical trials. It was recently used to design a clinical trial for COVID-19 in Singapore. The AI platform predicted a combination therapy using remdesivir, that's the Gilead drug, along with 2 antiretroviral medications that had previously been approved to treat HIV. The trial was designed in 2 weeks and required 3 magnitude fewer tests than typically the case. And so that's the kind of acceleration that we're going to be expecting with AI. By the way, that same platform approved the ineffectiveness of hydroxychloroquine in treating COVID-19. The next stage in this development of artificial intelligence tools are virtual trials and robotic process automation. These use advanced computer modeling and simulations in the development or even in the regulatory evaluation of a drug. Further down the line, but more exotic, is testing drugs on artificial agents. Just as some companies are growing meat in the laboratory, others are investigating whether animal organs can be grown and used for testing purposes. And the holy grail of AI clinical testing is robots that will emulate humans in their reaction to drugs. Testing on robots would have to perfectly emulate the drug pathways and interaction in humans. We don't yet have the mathematical models for how drugs interact with cellular or viral targets, but we will eventually. The biochemistry involved is based on classical physics, how molecules attach to receptors in the cell or in the virus, and how they move throughout the body. So as the databases and the algorithms improve, AI could predict those interactions. It could also help, as I said, predict the intercellular trajectories, including whether it will pass through membranes or get beyond the blood-brain barrier and things of that nature. Clinical trials on robots are still many years away, but they will come, and maybe they'll come in time for the next pandemic.
Very good. Well, great, Karl. Thank you so much for that overview, and we'll take some questions now. So again, if you have some specific questions, just add them to the chat, and I'll pull them off the chat and pose them to Karl. And if at some future time you want to, both Karl and I would be happy to hear from any of you. Our emails are there, and you can find us, as always, at Loyola Law School. So let me, Karl, go to the chat and see what our guests want to talk about.
There's so much to talk about.
There is so much. So here's a question. People have been spending more time online, at home and online, and they're relying on online information to make their decisions. So we're all doing that. Do I have to, can I go here? Can I fly in a plane? So on and so forth. With the improvement in machine learning, our guest asks, AI is able to distort and mimic the real world. So how do we discern what's true? What's the good advice? What's the received wisdom out there? How will this mixing of truth, AI generated information be counterproductive with the compliance of individuals towards apps, wearable technology, et cetera? That's a great question.
Yeah, and it's not limited to AI or COVID-19. I mean, AI actually helps the creation of fake news and misinformation and targeting and behavioral targeting. It certainly does that. We've seen that in so many contexts, including our elections. I think you have to go to trusted sites if you're trying to get reliable information. I would certainly stay away from things you read on social media and rely upon that. I mean, it's fun to look at these things and to kind of play around and maybe come up with some conclusions. But if you're going to do anything that's going to jeopardize your own health or the health of your family or friends or even strangers, I would be very, very careful in what I relied on. So I think our public health officials, the CDC folks, folks at NIAID, that's Fauci, they're about as trustworthy as they come. The WHO, obviously a lot of research institutions, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, Berkeley. These are pretty reliable sources for information, but I'd be very careful with Google searches.
Well, and that said, we've certainly seen some august institutions change their mind and change their advice as more information has come forth. And we've also seen some embarrassing retractions from some august institutions as well. So I think the question, really is a discerning one. We really are challenged as to because we have to make decisions, and making decisions with imperfect information is always a enterprise. Yeah, Karl.
One of the recent phenomenon is for researchers, even well-minded researchers, to publish their data before it is peer-reviewed. So traditionally, to get data out there and results out there, you would go to one of the appropriate journals, Cell, Nature, and so forth. And there's a 6 to 9 month peer review process where your results they try to replicate your results and validate the data. And that's quite reliable, although not foolproof, as we saw with the Lancet's retraction of the hydroxychloroquine study just a couple of days ago. But in an effort to get the data out as fast as possible, remember, we're doing this at warp speed, and lots of things can go wrong at warp speed. So these preprint servers that I mentioned, bioRxiv, medRxiv, are not peer-reviewed, and people can just post up there willy-nilly, and most of that is is trying to aid in this collaborative effort to come up with vaccines and therapies. But there's a lot of noise in scientific research, and that's why if the results are not reproducible by disinterested third parties, then they're really not very good. And that kind of describes the information we get through our web searches as well, right? So there have been a lot of errors made, not necessarily pernicious, but a lot of errors made. That Lancet article, it was recalled not because the results were wrong. It's just that the data on which it was based, and I think it was based on hundreds of thousands of data points, that the researchers were unable to guarantee the pedigree of those data sources, which is essential for research. So it was appropriately withdrawn. It may come back up, once it just may have just been published prematurely. It may come that study may come back up as soon as those data points are verified, but we don't know. And so that is the trade-off here that we're seeing, and that is medical research, as I mentioned, typically takes 15 years to get a new drug. We're trying to do this by November 3rd, the election. There's a lot's going to go wrong. Right.
So here's a question, Karl, that certainly stumps me, but maybe not you. Has there been any consideration of organ-on-a-chip technology for testing? Does that phrase mean something to you? It doesn't to me.
No, it doesn't.
My ignorance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that are actually going on a chip, quite frankly, especially diagnostic testing. So, if any of you have gotten a COVID-19 test, it was probably a PCR test. In other words, they took a sample from your cheek or from your upper nasal passage. They took it to a lab. They isolated, proteins there, and then they made millions of copies of them through something called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. And then that way, because you can't see individual viruses, they're just too small. You have the most powerful electron microscopes probably can, but most testing facilities can't. So, but if you make hundreds of thousands or millions of copies, then you're more likely to see structures. And so that's what PCR does. And I think we see some of those diagnostic tools are on chips. I haven't heard of organs on chips per se, but again, what the chip does in silicon is tries to emulate the pathways and the reactions of the organic material, which means we have to understand that much better. And I think we're on the road to that, but I don't think we're there.
So one of our guests asks, COVID-19 has become increasingly politicized, which then gives either countries or parties within countries motivation to manipulate data. For example, the inclusion or exclusion of testing data. How can we trust the validity of AI-driven results given AI's sensitivity to the quality of data inputs?
Reproducibility is the answer. And that is you trust. Remember that old saying when we were playing nuclear war, trust but verify. You reproduce the results in the lab. You have very tightly controlled clinical trials, and that's where the expense and the time is. So, viruses are a lot like electrons. They don't respect national boundaries. They're really anarchists in that sense. So I think we have an earned mistrust in some of the numbers that are coming out, and we should be skeptical of surprising results in the vaccine or drug development activities. Anything that just seems to be too good to be true may very well be too good. So that's why the FDA goes through this very elaborate process of looking over your shoulder, reproducing the results, and making sure the data is clean. It's very easy to put up dirty data, and it's very easy to put up even clean data, but draw the wrong statistical conclusions from them. And so you can't hide your data in a situation like this. The data has to be available not just to the FDA, but to the entire world community, so that so other folks, it's like open source versus closed source when you're talking about computer programs. You want the data to be available to everybody so that if there are defects or misinterpretations in the data, they can be identified before they cause harm.
Right. Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left, so let me combine two questions for us, Karl, and they both inquire about intellectual property. In some sense, our intellectual property drives a lot of innovation in these sectors, but given the pandemic, is there a concern that intellectual property, that is patenting or copywriting something, would gum up the works, would actually have the perverse result of restricting the public's access to anything that AI might lead us to uncover?
That's a really good question. I have been surprised myself, given the intellectual property regime that most countries subscribe to, how much collaboration there has been around the world. So typically, publishing results is something that you never do until you file at least a provisional patent application. Because although it's not necessarily true in the US, it is true everywhere else in the world. If you publish even a day before you file for your patent is going to be rejected. And so, as I said, a lot of the methodologies and test results are being put up on these preprint servers, bioRxiv, medRxiv, and doing so before a patent application is filed means that you're going to be cut out from intellectual property protection pretty much everywhere, except for perhaps in the United States. The United States gives you a 1-year grace period to file after publication, but other countries do not. So that's something that's different, that's new, and that's because of the pandemic. Will this type of collaboration and free use of each other's data, will that persist after this pandemic goes away? I don't know. But there need to be other incentives for the extraordinary investments that are required in both AI and in medical therapies and vaccines. Various governments are putting a lot of money into it, but typically the fruits of that research belongs to the company, even a private company that receives that money. I think there may be some re-examination of some of the IP rules going forward. For one thing, data, for the most part, isn't protected. And the only way to protect your data is through trade secrets. But you're not helping the global effort to fight COVID-19 if you keep your data secret. So firms are making the conscious decision to forego protection in order to ramp up. And that's very gratifying.
Excellent. Well, great, Karl. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you who dropped in to hear this discussion. Again, both Karl and I would be delighted to hear from anyone out there with any further thoughts. And if you're aware of things that might fit in this train of inquiry, please send it on, because we're always happy to read anything that is sent to us in these areas. So anyway, thank you, and thanks to Justin Levitt and the folks at Loyola for putting on this Legal Lunch Bites series, and hope you enjoy it. Future episodes. Thanks to Maya for hosting it, and I think we'll end the session.